Chapter 4: The Structural Responses to Capability, Complexity Mismatch. When the capability of a society begins to fall behind the complexity of the systems it operates, the system does not immediately break. It adapts. But the form of that adaptation is not neutral. Civilizations under strain follow recognizable structural paths long before visible collapse appears. These responses are not ideological choices. They are mechanical reactions to cognitive and organizational scarcity. At the heart of this moment lies a fork. A civilization facing a widening gap between what its systems demand and what its population can reliably supply has only two broad options. It can simplify, reducing ambition, scale, and institutional load to match the capability it still possesses. Or it can substitute, attempting to preserve complexity by replacing human competence with artificial structural supports. This chapter maps the substitution pathways. It does not claim that all societies choose them. It does not claim that substitution guarantees collapse. It establishes the forms that repeatedly emerge when societies attempt to maintain complexity without maintaining capability. These mechanisms appear across history with remarkable consistency. The technology changes. The language changes. The administrative style changes. But the structural response does not. Process replacing judgment. The mildest and earliest substitution occurs when judgment begins to be encoded into procedure. High-capability systems rely primarily on discretion. Operators are trusted to interpret context, balance competing priorities, and resolve ambiguity through experience. Rules remain few because understanding is dense. Coordination is fluid because meaning is shared. As capability thins, this equilibrium inverts. Judgment becomes uneven. Discretion becomes risky. Informal coordination becomes fragile. The system responds by freezing behavior into scripts. Checklists replace interpretation. Forms replace evaluation. Decision trees replace thinking. At first, this appears sensible. Procedures feel like protection against error. But what is actually occurring is an externalization of cognition. Intelligence leaves the operator and enters the document. The system still functions, but it now functions because behavior is constrained, not because understanding is present. Over time, the meaning of the procedure itself begins to decay. Operators follow steps without grasping purpose. When outcomes fail, no one can diagnose why, because the system no longer contains the thinking required to interpret deviation. Responsibility dissolves into compliance. This is not degeneration through malice. It is a defensive adaptation to declining judgment density. Metrics replacing reality. As complexity increases and judgment weakens further, systems lose the ability to directly evaluate performance. Diagnosis becomes ambiguous. Outcomes are difficult to interpret. The system responds by turning to measurement. Metrics are attractive because they appear objective. They compress complexity into legible signals. They promise comparability across scale. They allow distant oversight without local understanding. But metrics are not reality. They are shadows of reality. And once a shadow becomes a target, the object casting it no longer matters. Behavior rapidly reorients toward the indicator rather than the underlying function. Education optimizes for scores rather than mastery. Hospitals optimize for throughput rather than recovery. Policing optimizes for counts rather than safety. Bureaucracies optimize for compliance rather than service. At this stage, the system becomes performative. It learns how to appear functional while becoming less so. This is not fraud in the moral sense. It is survival within abstraction. The institution cannot reliably evaluate reality anymore, so it evaluates its own representations instead. Rules replacing trust. As both judgment and measurement lose reliability, trust begins to erode. Where trust collapses, legalism expands. Every interaction becomes guarded. Every decision is hedged. Every relationship is converted into formal obligation. Disclaimers multiply. Liability dominates. The system ceases to assume good faith and begins to defend itself from its own participants. This is the stage where rules become cheap. Rules multiply faster than they can be meaningfully enforced. Interpretation fragments. Exceptions proliferate. Selective application becomes normal. The same regulation is rigidly enforced against the weak and quietly suspended for the powerful. The written rule remains intact while its reality dissolves. This selective enforcement is not merely corruption in the conventional sense. It is a structural consequence of enforcement capacity falling behind legal surface area. The civilization retains the appearance of legal order while losing the capability to sustain it uniformly. Trust decays not because rules are absent, but because rules no longer mean what they claim to mean. Oversight replacing skill. As operator reliability continues to fall, institutions multiply supervisors. Supervision expands first as a safeguard, then as an assumption, then as a default mode of operation. Workers are reviewed. Reviewers are reviewed. Auditors audit auditors. Regulators regulate regulators. Each layer exists not because it adds productive capacity, but because it compensates for a loss of confidence below it. The system grows vertically without growing wiser. Energy migrates from production into observation. At a certain point, more people are supervising than performing. The system becomes self-referential. It expends increasing effort watching itself operate rather than operating. This phase feels like institutional maturity from the inside. It feels like sclerosis from the outside. Messaging replacing diagnosis. As structural failure becomes visible yet politically dangerous, institutions begin managing perception. Public communication expands. Messaging becomes disciplined. Language softens. Data is reframed. Timelines lengthen. Uncertainty is concealed. Failure is contextualized. Optimism becomes mandatory. Gradually, diagnosis gives way to narrative. This is the stage where a civilization begins to protect itself from reality. Not necessarily through censorship, but through distortion, buffering, delay, and selective emphasis. Information still exists, but it no longer circulates freely. It moves upward softened, downward filtered, and outward curated. Leaders become blind not because information disappears, but because truth becomes structurally dangerous to transmit. Bureaucracy replacing capability. All previous substitutions eventually concentrate into the final transformation. Bureaucracy becomes the primary stabilizing force of the system. At this stage, institutions no longer function because they are competently operated. They function because they are procedurally frozen. The scaffolding becomes load-bearing. Removing it would cause immediate failure, yet maintaining it drains what little capability remains. Rules are now cheap symbols rather than functional instruments. Compliance becomes more important than correctness. Documentation becomes more important than truth. Initiative becomes a liability. Responsibility dissolves into structure. This is the phase in which civilizations appear hyper-organized while becoming internally hollow. Why scaffolding expands instead of contracts. Systems do not simplify automatically under capability loss because simplification threatens power, status, and survival. Every procedure creates a role. Every oversight body creates a budget. Every metric creates a department. Every compliance layer creates careers. Institutional actors become economically dependent on complexity. Simplification becomes self-destructive. Reform threatens jobs, prestige, authority, and income. As a result, complexity becomes politically protected even as it becomes functionally destructive. What began as emergency support becomes permanent load. The illusion of stability. The danger of substitution is not immediate collapse. The danger is extended illusion. Substituted systems can persist for decades while appearing robust, expanding administratively, projecting control, maintaining formal order. This is why civilizations often look most organized shortly before contraction. History contains many states that appeared administratively magnificent even as their human core quietly thinned. The non-deterministic exit. This chapter does not assert that substitution guarantees collapse. It establishes that substitution converts human strain into structural mass. Some societies later simplify. Some stabilize temporarily. Some fragment under shock. Some reconstitute elsewhere. The mechanism is structural. The outcome remains contingent. Why these structures reappear across civilizations? These substitution responses do not arise from ideology or moral decline. They arise from human constraint. They are the universal ways complex systems attempt to outsource cognition, judgment, trust, diagnosis, and responsibility when those capacities become scarce. That is why the same patterns appear in ancient river states, mercantile republics, imperial bureaucracies, industrial powers, and digital administrative societies alike. The form changes. The logic does not. By the time a civilization is building procedural mass faster than human capability, it has already begun the transition from organic competence to mechanical survival. The pages that follow move from theory to history, not to prove this structure, but to observe it as it first emerged in full view. This completes the theoretical foundation. The next chapter turns to the ancient world, Mesopotamia and Egypt, to demonstrate how these structural principles manifested in the first complex societies.